Welcome to the BVTV network, coming from the UK studios of BizVision. I'm your host, Malcolm Gallagher. My parents used to say to me, it costs nothing to be civil. And that thinking has remained with me throughout my life. Quite simply, I get angry when people are uncivil, incivil, to those trying their best to help me. A syndrome which seems to be growing worse each day as the greed or me culture grows. But that's just anger on my part. Where I move to despise or move to despair is where I see leaders be not civil to their people. In fact, research from the recent pandemic showed that in the UK alone, 1 in 4 employees are ready to move employer because of the way they were treated by their leaders during lockdown. So let's try and put a stop to this lack of civility in business. Let's go meet civility expert and author of Civility at Work. Welcome, Dr. Lewena Bayer. Hello, Lou.
Hello, Malcolm. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you for having me today.
I feel as though we're almost close friends, because where are you today?
I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Thank you. Smack in the middle of the country.
Yeah, but Canada's a close friend and close ally of the UK. So it's almost like we're next door neighbors, isn't it?
I would agree with that. Yes. And I wish I was in your sunny city today. It's a bit dreary here today in Winnipeg.
Yeah, we've got a storm on the way, but never mind.
Oh.
Lou, I wasn't kidding when I said in my opening piece of how I despise and despair of leaders who have a lack of civility. I think your interview is going to give us both an awakener and a path forward. Viewers and listeners, I'll be talking to Lou in 3 parts. In part 1, I want to ask her, what's the state of incivility in the workplace at the moment? Is it, as I suspect, getting worse? And what's the impact of that worsening situation? In part 2, I want to ask her, what should companies and their leaders especially be doing about it? And in part 3, I want to ask her how leaders can ensure that civility is embedded in their culture, is sustainable, and it's not just one of those one-off efforts. But first, Lou, can you briefly tell us who is Dr. Lewena Bayer and why your passion for civility?
Oh, thank you. I from your opening, I can tell that we have some things in common in terms of my parents saying that to me all the time too, that civility costs nothing. You know, my mother, manners cost nothing. And I think maybe from an early age, with our kind of uptight, my British background and so on too, I think I was raised with that, like the rules matter and propriety was critical and seen and not heard. A little bit old fashioned now that I'm older, but my parents were very rigid about social protocol and how you behaved and so on. And I think that set me up at the time to do this kind of work. I didn't realize after I did my education, I studied social psychology at McGill University and went on to do a master's program and other studies, and found myself in various workplaces always solving the people problems. And civility is, in fact, a people problem that most organizations overlook or diminish in terms of the ability of civility at work and resolving people problems to change workplace culture, to fix health, to build retention, all of those things, which I guess we'll talk about in part 2. But I worked professional jobs, executive positions most of my life, and after a stint, horribly stressful 90-hour work weeks, weekends, and a very difficult job as director of operations for a hotel chain. A colleague of mine at the time and I one day went for lunch and decided, we need to see if we can do something different and stop talking about what's wrong and try to fix it. So we quit our jobs, got a small women in business loan at the time that was available, and started the business. That was in 1999. And so since then, I bought my business partner out. We now have 500 affiliates in 47 countries.
Wow.
Our focus is civility, which is a measurable competency. I travel and teach about 250 days a year, There's never a dull moment. People are rude all over the world. In almost every context, people need some supports with their social skills.
Hey, we've got something in common as well there. We started BizVision in 1999. It must have been one of those years of spark when we felt we better get started before the next millennium.
Yes, I bet. I think so.
Let's move into part one, Lou. What do you think is the state of the lack of civility, or do we call it incivility, in the workplace at the moment? Is it, as I suspect and said in my opening piece, getting worse? And what's the impact of that worsening situation?
Oh, it's most definitely worse, or maybe it's not worse than it was before, but because of our easy access to data, and being able to share information, there's huge, meaty research about incivility at work and the consequences of that. So, for example, CDC, the Center for Disease Control, said that by 2025, depression, largely due to incivility and perceived incivility at work, will be second only to ischemic heart disease as the leading cause of workplace illness.
Wow.
We know that research shows all sorts of stress-related illnesses, and civility can impact that in a positive or a negative way. We see that about 80% of people cite being dissatisfied with their work, so they're unhappy at work. They're going to take that unhappy home and on the streets when they're driving home, to social situations, to the school with their children. So there's all sorts of third-party impact. We see that less than 10% of employees say they trust their leaders, they trust their bosses. So we know that trust is a big factor, and that where there's low trust, there's high incivility. There's all sorts of measurable impacts, and we've captured a big chunk of that in the new book. But to your earlier point, there's no question incivility is rampant, and it's I would say almost in crises condition.
Well, what are the key ways, though, that incivility is expressed in a business? You have to help me here, because it's a while since I worked in a large business. Yes, I work with large businesses, as a consultant, but now I'm actually working in it. So, is it rudeness of language? What is it? What are the key ones? I know there's plenty.
Yes, it's all of those things. When we observe in workplaces and audit, do civility audits, there's this continuum of incivility, and it starts all the way at the low end with, ignorance, people just not knowing that, oh, I'm supposed to be here at 9, not 10 after 9, where there's a lack of unwritten rules, people just fill in the blanks. And so some of it is general ignorance, well-intentioned people making mistakes or not paying attention. And we see that it manifests as perceived rudeness. You're late, you didn't prepare, you didn't dress appropriately, you didn't offer me a sandwich, why didn't you hold the door? Some of those common courtesies are forgotten. And then as we move along the continuum, we see things like overt disrespect. So, microaggressions, people rolling their eyes, people sneering, underhanded comments or outright insults. A lot of that we see on social media. This lack of restraint, emotionality at work that was never perceived as appropriate before. And then moving along, we see deceit, we see theft, we see people not citing sources and borrowing without giving credit, intellectual property issues. We see people feigning credentials. This kind of lack of transparency and authenticity, kind of fake it till you make it to the extreme. And then we see, as we go on further, racism and bigotry and sexism. We see outright prejudice at work. We see people making the wrong choices in terms of who gets promoted. The way we do performance evaluations has changed. It used to be competency-based, and now there's bribery and people, favoritism and nepotism. It's this whole big thing. But I would say the biggest factor right now is that due to COVID and other factors, people just feel that their basic safety needs, psychological safety, financial safety, job security. The basic needs are not being met. Organizations are letting safety standards slip because of budgets. They're not giving proper training and tools so people can do their work. They're not paying people. Some of that is, again, a result of pandemic, but when those psychological and physical and financial baseline things are not met, we see huge increases in incivility at work.
Wow, that's very frightening, isn't it? Because,
Mhm.
in my sort of, let me call it naive way, not being obviously in a large company every day, I think things like remote or hybrid working is going to increase the incivility because people just won't have that connection, will they?
I agree with you. And that's what we're seeing. Many people, there's mixed reports. Some are more productive. I think it depends on the nature of the work and the individual. And if there was some resentment already brewing and people are going to get even by taking advantage and wasting time or, billing for hours when they're at the beach and, those kind of things, some of that's going to happen. But the social connection, I think we'll start to see the impact of not having that and not building the face-to-face, the physicality of social relationships. I think in the next 2 to 5 years, we're going to really start to feel the impact of that. Right now, people are enjoying the summer and some time at home and catching up with their kids and families. And, I think there's a point where some of that depression and the financial impact and the social withdrawal, some of that is going to catch up with us. But in terms of incivility, I think people don't know what the expectations are. So the fact that we have to tell people, you should put real pants on when you're on Zoom, just in case you forget and stand up. Or you should probably make sure, that your big dog isn't barking behind you, or that somebody's not walking down the stairs dressed inappropriately, right? I
Yes.
mean, the fact that we
Oops.
have to teach people common sense suggests to me that it's just not common practice. These high social standards, we really let things lapse.
Yeah. All fascinating stuff, but we're going to correct that in our next couple of parts. But Lou, before we move to part 2, let me just remind everyone of your 2 URLs. Hey, we're doing a bonus for you here. 2 URLs. Okay, visit viewers. Obviously, you can see it on the screen behind me, but for listeners, let me just take you through those 2. So it's Lou, Lew Bayer, Bayer, LewBayer.com. And the other one is civilityexperts.com, civilityexperts.com. And Lou's book of the moment is Civility at Work. What's the book about, Lew, and where can it be bought?
Oh, thank you. It's available on Amazon, of course, and e-version and a print version, and it's about civility at work. So it's a follow-up to a multi-best-selling book called The 30% Solution from about 7 or 8 years ago. That book was based on some research proving that organizations that embed civility in their policies and practices experience on average 30% increases in retention, engagement, and up to 30% increases in bottom line revenues. So there's a really solid business case. And this new book is all the updated research. It's a toolkit. There's assessments and activities and strategies and plans for how organizations can start to see the benefit of civility, defining it, what are best practices, all of those things.
Brilliant. Yeah. And that let's just repeat that figure. Was it 30% that you've just said that people can gain by?
30%, right? So what would you do as an organization, profit or not for profit? 30% more revenue. Wouldn't that be significant, especially in these times, right?
Exceptional. That is a really important figure, Lou. Then we'll remind people as we go through. Right, part 2. Let's start to change the world. What should companies and their leaders especially be doing about this incivility? You see, there's an old expression over here in the old UK that the fish stinks from the head downwards. I was just wondering if that is the cause of a lot of incivility right at the top.
Yes, I would say, we define workplace culture as the day-to-day experience of the people living in that culture. And my sense is that while everybody has some influence and impact, it's really leadership, the top down, that sets the tone. And, everything from what are your corporate values and have you defined them? And if you're reworking them, let's put civility in there and define what civility looks like and sounds like and acts like in your organization. So, you asked what can people do? And the first thing is to, recognize that their workplaces are uncivil. And we have all kinds of free assessments and all kinds of tools to actually look at what is the level of incivility, and then, what are we going to do about fixing it? But I think a lot of organizations dismiss it. They say, oh, it's just poor communication, it's just temperament, it's people in a bad mood. It's like, they really diminish the impact that they can have to monitor and control and really manage incivility. And civility should be embedded in every job description, every performance review, and we help people understand how to do that. But the first step is recognizing that I, as a leader, have a moral and, in most cases, even legal obligation to treat people well. And I like to tell leaders, treat people better. I mean, even if you think you're doing it well, let's take it up even one more notch. And so they have to acknowledge that there is incivility. We have to look at it, measure it, pick out the aspects that are the most significant in terms of harming people, and let's fix those. And it's really surprising how quickly and cost effectively you can change people's experience at work and improve the conditions and culture and see some of those benefits: engagement, retention, profitability. It doesn't take a lot of time or money.
And I think if leaders, who are the obviously hard ones to change, because they may talk about wanting change, but not for themselves, for everybody else.
Yes.
I think that teaser, should we say, of that hanging thing of 30% improvement should be what they should be looking at probably first.
That's right. And it's a sad comment on human nature, and you've captured it right there. I referenced the business case. We would hope that people would want to do better and be better and treat people well because it's the right thing to do. But in some cases, that's not enough. And so for organizations where, maybe it's things like manufacturing, organizations that are well established, kind of ingrained traditions about the culture. In those cases, we try to change the behavior of leadership and hope that the attitude follows, because it's very difficult to change a mindset first. I don't want to have to convince people that you should be nice. That's not my job. My job is to show them the behaviors that project trust, build trust, show people that they're valued, protect this kind of human condition. I don't work with companies if I need to persuade them that fair and just equity, equality is the way to go. I can't help those people. I can't shift that mindset. But if they're willing to change the behavior and the conditions, we have all kinds of brilliant supports, and they'll see, within 90 days, usually we see measurable impact.
Within 90 days?
Mm-hmm.
That's fast. That's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. And I think, we've been talking a lot on BVTV about conscious leadership. You're obviously interested in planet, people and profits. But I think we've added a fourth P, purpose. And a lot of people have gravitated towards that. So perhaps there is this movement across the world that people are starting to say, hey, we need to do something about it. Do you think that's true, Lou?
Oh, absolutely. And, that it might be helpful to know that when we're talking about civility, it's a measurable competency. So there are 4 skills that underpin the ability to be civil. They are social intelligence, cultural competence, continuous learning, and systems thinking. And systems thinking is what you've just touched on. It's helping people understand that we're all connected. What I do, short-term or long-term, is going to impact you. It's going to impact the community, what organizations do with their waste and how they hire, where they source their products and so on. All of that impacts in many ways the systems that they work in and around. So when people adopt this mentality and understanding that when we're good to ourselves and to each other, there's this expanded systems benefit, and good is good for all. So it's really interesting that that there, I do believe there is that kind of cultural shift, organizational cultural shift towards those purpose and people and profit. I believe you can have it all. You
Yeah,
can.
yeah. And those companies that don't make that move, I'm going to suggest to you, Lou, won't be around for much longer, because their shareholders, stakeholders, and investors, what you want to call them, and employees, will vote with their feet. Okay, final part then, part 3. All too often, initiatives happen and they quickly die away amongst, let's call it, the busyness of business. How can leaders ensure that civility becomes embedded in their business culture, that it's sustainable and not that one-off effort? Can it be genuinely measured, such as, I don't know, employee satisfaction levels, or is all that too weak?
Oh, no. With a proper civility initiative, civility has to be embedded into the processes and the procedures. We see it in SOPs, we see it in codes of communication, codes of conduct. It's an important part of evaluation when you do performance reviews. When it's embedded properly, it becomes sustainable. And part of the way we define civility is that it's a non-negotiable point of character. So you can't just be nice on Tuesdays and Saturdays, or you just treat the VIPs well. There's a consistency and an expectation in terms of standard that is established, and people are held accountable, and we have to maintain it. So when it's done well, and we help people do that, and again, it's not really terribly expensive to do. The big thing is the commitment. People have to buy into it, and it doesn't take very long, because I often say that civility is its own reward. And I'm sure you've experienced this based on, your upbringing, what you said, to how your parents raised you. But if you give respect and trust with no expectation of return, it's astonishing how, that comes back to you. But the gift is in the giving, right? You really have to do it because it's who you are, not because you expect something in return. And if the whole work team and the whole organization takes that approach, it's in a matter of months, we can change workplace culture significantly.
And I have to say to you, Lou, I've worked as a consultant with many companies who are civil with each other there, and the difference in that business, it's a pleasure to go and work with them.
Yes.
There's a vibrancy. Well, I know from one BVTV interview, viewers and listeners, can't change the world, but a start has to be made somewhere to challenge this incivility. So will you now take that challenge on from here and be your company's civility champion? Thanks, Lou, for a stimulating interview.
Thank you. And I would just like to close by saying that, I find that, as you've just done, when you invite people to bring their best self to every opportunity, every conversation, every interaction, when they choose civility, they will discover really quickly that civility is its own reward.